Hello Internet, this is Daniel with Driving and Dragons, back with another world building video today. We're not going to be looking at the 280ZX today, as the distributor is still not here, and we're kind of at a standstill on some of the repairs and restoration project there, but what we are going to look at is some still photos of various vehicles. Now, some of these are taken from Facebook Marketplace in my area. Some of them are actually physical vehicles that are nearby me that I know I can access. But the important thing is every one of these vehicles can be had for less than $2,000, most of them less than $1,000, and these are potential projects for the future. So I'm going to put down a couple of these vehicles, as well as the text on the screen will talk about some of the potential costs associated with some restoration stuff for them to kind of get them fixed up to where they can have something. Because one of the things I want to show is, if you do a lot of the work yourself, just how realistic having a pretty cool project car could be for somebody. And the second thing is as I've stated before, I would love to get this channel to the point where it makes enough money to where over time I can rebuild and give away some vehicles. I want to show that not only is that possible and feasible, but where if the channel can make a few $100s a month, that it's possible and feasible giving away a car every couple of years or so. Nothing special, and we're not making anything a Pebble Beach restoration. We're not turning anything into something that's going to go tear up your local drag strip or rip your local racetrack apart, but the kind of thing that you can take on a cruise night or to a Cars and Coffee or out for a weekend and just have a good time in and be proud of and look cool. So kind of a little bit of a two-step thing. One, there's no reason you can't do this yourself. It's not as expensive as a lot of people think if you do a lot of the work yourself, and especially over time. And then also, just kind of showing how feasible it would be to accomplish this goal I have. But the video itself today, we are back talking about world building as a whole, since the controversy market seems to be a little died down in the tabletop role-playing game sphere right now, which I find refreshing. It's nice for everybody to be kind of quietly getting along and not griping about the same old stuff again. And we're going to talk today about Mega Dungeons. Big, giant Mega Dungeons have been a big topic of conversation here over the past several months, and really it's kind of a constant topic of conversation amongst game masters and players of these tabletop role-playing games. I want to talk about how to world build Mega Dungeons, how to integrate them, how to make them something that's not just a gonzo thing. But we're going to talk about them both in the narrative sense and the adventure gonzo or mechanical sense, and how it works differently for each of those. The other thing I'm going to talk about is what is a Mega Dungeon. Now, the much bandy-hooed mythical underworld or mythical dungeon is one of those things that was actually put forward by OSR gamers back in the 2000s as a possible explanation for why a mega dungeon would exist in a game, or why these big kind of gonzo dungeons that don't make sense within the reality of the world exist. But for all intents and purposes, a mega dungeon is just any, I would say, unrealistically large dungeon. It's anything that is going to take the scope of multiple adventures, multiple trips. It's any time you are creating a dungeon that can more or less exist as its own world, almost in and of itself. I would say, at least to my knowledge, the first commercially available, quote, mega dungeon that people would be familiar with would be the Temple of Elemental Evil, because the Temple of Elemental Evil, with its multiple floors, with its multiple themes, and with its design to cover a large scope and kind of being a monolithic presence within the world of Village of Hamlet through the giants and the drow and the various different individual modules that lead up to the Temple of Elemental Evil, if you want to play them that way. All of these things lead to it being a mega dungeon, even though it would not be the largest mega dungeon by any stretch of the imagination. And based on size alone, you might have some people who'd say it doesn't qualify these days. But to me, it really is kind of the progenitor of the mega dungeon idea, because you played Dungeons and Dragons or AD&D, you played Village of Hamlet, you went through the Giants modules and the Drow modules, and these things led up to the Temple of Elemental Evil that was always there in the background from day one. And it is a large dungeon that has multiple distinct levels that are cut off from each other, that are almost separate from each other, that are different challenges in and of themselves, that allows you to have clearly defined segments to go 1, 2, 3, 4, progress from here to here to here, which are all really the elements that make a good mega dungeon right there up front. So let's talk about mega dungeons. In the narrative gameplay, which is what I specialize in, I am a Hickman Revolution game master. I am not a story gamer, but I am very much a narrative game master. Story is important, and to me, control of the narrative and the overall control of the world, that is the game master's player agency at work. There is a place to be had for the whole, oh, the story is emergent storytelling, it comes from the player's actions. But that's only one style of play, and to me, it's really more mechanical. The game master needs to be focused on the world around. I've said it before 100,000 times. The game master needs to have a world that operates in and of itself. And a mega dungeon is really no different. So first off, if you have a narrative setting and you have a world you've put together to play with your group and with your table, the first thing, a mega dungeon needs to fit a theme within that world. It doesn't necessarily have to be well known to the entire population. It can be something that's hidden and lost and forgotten. It can be something that only the ultimate and super wise know about, or only otherworldly beings know about, that's very, works with the inner workings of the world, where, kind of think of it as backstage Disney, where all the characters are running from one place to the other and creating the magic in the miles of underground tunnels underneath the theme park. It can be that way, or it can be something that everybody knows about, like Temple of Elemental Evil. It's a giant temple that's just sitting right there outside of town. Everybody knows where it is and knows what it is. They stay the hell away from it. It can be like Diablo, and it can be the catacombs underneath the church in Tristram. But it needs to fit a theme. If that mega dungeon is going to exist within your game world, it needs to fit a theme. It needs to be tied to something. For instance, while the Mines of Moria and Khazad-dûm in the Lord of the Rings are not a mythical underworld, they do not fit that description, they would qualify as a mega dungeon, and they fit a specific theme. They are a giant dwarven citadel that was there for centuries before it fell, and then centuries it was corrupted by the Balrog that was released from digging too deep. And that theme pervades throughout the entirety of Moria, and the party of the Fellowship of the Ring passes through it. This is a perfectly good use of a mega dungeon in your game, especially narratively. You can have a situation where you have the great underground complex of the fallen gnome empire from 10,000 years ago, and it just so happens that, hey, we got to get here, and this is the shortcut to get there. It's the only way we can make it in time for the mission we're on, so we're going to pass through the upper halls. That can give those players a taste. It can let them know an idea of what to expect deeper in the dungeon while they pass through the upper level. And it gives them the hints that there's more below. It gives them the hints of great treasure, untold stories, ancient wisdom, and great deep evils. Maybe, let's say it has a theme of earth magic to it, because the Gnome Empire used earth magic and earth shaping and the summoning of elementals and things to do their mining. And those elementals rebelled, or they tried to take a noble earth elemental under their control, and it was not strong enough. They were not strong enough, so what they've done is a corrupted earth elemental now dominates everything in the lower levels of this mega dungeon. And when the character's party is passing through the upper level, just trying to get from point A to point B, they run across the weaker elementals and the other earth-shaping bending of reality in the upper level, where it's not necessarily bending reality or the world doesn't work normally, but because there's so much earth-shaping magic, or because the plane of the earth elementals has kind of overlaid the minds a little bit and it bleeds into the upper levels, they see this on the early adventures where they go through, and then when they come back they kind of have an idea of what to expect. This gives them a chance to prepare. It gives them a chance to have more of a chance to explore deeper. So fitting a theme is important to a mega dungeon in a narrative sense, because whether the mega dungeon happens to be everything that they're doing and it's the scope of the entire campaign, and just going into the mega dungeon is the entirety of what you're doing, or whether or not it's something that's there for them to come back to and explore, even if it has nothing to do with the main theme of your adventure, it's the ultimate side quest, it still has that information there to allow them to be foreshadowed on what to expect. Now, I do think a mega dungeon needs to either be what I would say is out of scope, or it needs to be unique in a way. So, for instance, when I say out of scope, I mean it's out of the scope of the rest of the world around it. I've talked before about world building, how everything needs to work together, how you have almost like the river of time from Dragonlance, the flow of events that your characters may have some influence over, but not a lot, because the world is moving forward and all these factors are working against each other. The mega dungeon needs to be separated from that. It needs to be something that it exists in and of itself, and it's relatively unique. There's not mega dungeons all over the place, but it kind of sits over there to the side and is apart from the rest of the world and is unchanged. Sometimes it may be unchanged for thousands and thousands of years. I'm again going to go back to the Mines of Moria as an example here. That is a world that was more or less now separate from the rest of Middle-earth because it was just kind of closed off. The Balrog was not in any way working with Sauron. It was not working with any other powers on the outside world. The orcs and goblins that had taken up residence in there were not part of either the armies of Saruman or the armies of Sauron. They just kind of existed in there, and that Khazad-dûm was going to exist as itself, completely independent of what was going on in Middle-earth until Sauron got the ring or the ring was destroyed, one or the other. And heck, even after the ring was destroyed, they still had to go clear out Moria. It wasn't like it just magically was empty. But it exists outside the scope of the rest of the story. It's doing its own thing. It's not influenced by the world. It needs to be tied to something of significance if you're going to use it in the narrative campaign. It can't just be a thing. If it is just a thing, it needs to be tied to something of significance way in the past. You don't just have a mega dungeon laying around. It's like, there's 500 levels of dungeon that just happens to exist under this mountain over here for no damn reason. What built it? Why is it there? What caused it to be corrupted? What causes this increasing level of power and difficulty and weirdness as you go deeper inside of it? What is the reason it exists, and why is it so mega? Why is it so large? Is it a natural cave complex that leads into something like the Underdark? Because the Underdark is, in a way, a mega dungeon. It's an entire underworld in Toril, but it is essentially a mega dungeon, separated from the rest of the world, existing on its own, rarely interacting with the surface, with its own factions and everything within it. That is essentially a mega dungeon. It's a really big one, but it's a mega dungeon. But why does it exist? What is it that influences it? It needs to be tied to something significant. And especially if you're going to make it a center point of a campaign or adventures, because there's going to be a series of adventures. Mega dungeons are never a one-shot. They're never a two-shot. If that's going to be a focal point, it needs to be tied to something of significance. Every game master, especially every narrative game master, has come across this concept before, this problem before, where they introduce a series of adventures and they set some plot hooks. But because those plot hooks are not super directly related to whatever grand mission the characters have, you always have that one member of the party who's like, yeah, we're just going to go around that village and ignore whatever the problem is. Or, hey guys, you're on your own because we have a mission to deliver this item to the Duke's Keep over there, and we don't have time to screw around with whatever this adventure that was planned for this area is. We don't need to do that. You always run across that. So, especially if you're talking a mega dungeon, which is a tremendous amount of work and effort to be put into it, the last thing you want is people just going around it. Now, keep in mind that a mega dungeon can be potentially the entire campaign, but it can also just be a piece of set dressing that turns into the ultimate side quest. But you can set a mega dungeon to be something that is, going into it is everything. Because one key feature that happens with mega dungeons is the idea that you go in and you come back out, you go in and you come back out, and you go in and you come back out, and you explore more, and then you come back out. And you know the way to get to where you were before, so you go back down there quicker and you explore a little bit more. And you get a little deeper each time, and then you get to the point where you're actually setting up camp and trying to find safe locations within the mega dungeon, because it's more than a day's travel in to get where you're at. So it can potentially be the entire campaign, going from, in Dungeons and Dragons terms, first level to 20th level by the time you get to the bottom, with a grand epic quest. But there really kind of needs to be lesser quests to get you in there in the first place, because your first level character is not going to go in to defeat the great demon at the bottom because they know they're going to get destroyed. So you need to have something more than that and have these quests within it. That leads me to the other side of things, away from narrative gaming into adventure, gonzo, OSR style play, where story doesn't really matter, or you're entirely reliant on emergent storytelling. Big things there, and most of these are somewhat true or are largely true in the narrative context too. But if you're going to build a mega dungeon in the gonzo, randomly generated style, one thing is it needs to be progressive in size and scope. Remember that the upper levels, or the entry levels to your mega dungeon, are designed for your lower levels. They have less resources, they can't go as far. If you have gigantic levels for the first level characters, or for the first through third level characters early on, then you create two problems. One, it takes them forever to clear anything out, because they can only do a few rooms or a few encounters at a time, and they're having to go in and out, and in and out, and in and out. And then once they've gotten to the level where that's easy, now you're boring them and wasting their time, because they've got 15,000 encounters to get from level 1 to level 3, and they're just wiping them out without even trying, and they're not even, you're tracking XP, and they don't even get enough XP for it to be helpful. It's really just a waste. You get to the point where the ranger is hitting the enemies with his bow rather than shooting arrows, because he doesn't want to waste arrows on the monsters, because you've made levels 1, 2, 3, and 4 too big. So it should be progressive in size. It should also be progressive in scope. The amount of enemies, the number of types of encounters, how often encounters appear. Maybe the first couple of levels of the dungeon are just a dungeon, and there's very little in them. Maybe they're so basic, basic caves and stuff, and once they've been cleared out, they're pretty much cleared out more or less forever. You have a few natural things that'll come back into them, but if there were 20 encounters in the first level the first time they went in, when they come back in the second time, there's only going to be 1 or 2, because that scope is progressive. And as they get lower, not only is there more there, is there bigger size, but there's also more encounters, more styles of encounters, more dangers, more power, it's more depth, but it also replenishes more because you've gotten more magical or more access to outside things. It's not as complete when you finish it the first time. And the biggest thing especially if you're going, and this is going to be where there's a big difference between narrative and adventure style. In a narrative style mega dungeon, it's far more important that it makes sense within the world. In an adventure or Gonzo or OSR style Mega Dungeon, it's far more important that the level makes mechanical sense for the game. In other words, it's more important that a monster fits or a monster or an encounter or whatever fits the level and the abilities of the characters in a metagame sense on a specific level, then it matters that it makes sense that that thing is there in the first place. To use the classic straw man example, the giant who's in a room that he has no business being in because the door is too small and the room is barely big enough for him to be in. How does he live there, etc., etc.? Well, he lives there in the Gonzo adventure setting because that makes mechanical sense, because that giant is a meaningful challenge for those characters. In the narrative sense, he's probably not going to be there at all unless you have a damn good reason why there is a giant trapped in this room. Maybe he becomes a social encounter and he's trapped there by some kind of magic and really wants to be out more than anything else, and fighting him is not the best way to handle it. Finding a way to allow him to escape his chamber in the Mega Dungeon is the way to do it. But that's the big thing. Narrative game, it needs to make narrative sense. It needs to make sense within the world. It needs to make sense within the theme of that dungeon. You're not going to have enemies that don't fit whatever your theme for that dungeon is. Adventure Gonzo OSR style is going to matter more about it making mechanical sense for that monster to be there, because it is the appropriate challenge for that level of the dungeon. Anyway, that's what I have to say on this for right now. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Like, share, and subscribe. I will see you guys next time. And let me know which of these little projects that I threw up on the screen look like there's something that would be more to your liking. Which one do you think is the cooler project to go after? Because I'm eventually, probably in the next several months, going to finish the 280ZX. And it's going to be time to move on to something different. And that's either going to be my Camaro or it's going to be one of these other projects, depending on what works best. So let me know what you think down below. See you guys next time.